I'm Eric, and you're watching Standard Meta coverage here on the sideboard. Don't forget to like if you enjoy the coverage, and to subscribe to stay up to date. And if you like any of today's decks, check for the links in the description box below, all of which are proven in some way. Most have top 16 or better in a major event. And I would like to also say that any tier system that I use is a personal opinion. Any ranking system or order in which I put the decks is a 100% personal opinion. And we've got a lot to cover today, so let's get right into it. I notice that the meta has definitely been a lot of Scarab God versus Glorybringer or Hazoret, and it may be a Scarab God versus Glorybringer or Hazoret meta, but that doesn't mean those are the only strategies that could take you to a first place victory. And today we're going to cover the top tier strategies, and then we're going to cover the other strategies that could definitely steal a championship or a tournament somewhere. And hopefully the Pro Tour will show us many more new strategies that we can cover next week. So let's jump right into our first strategy today. This is tier 1 at its finest. Like, this deck has almost reached the point of menace on standard. This is Temur Energy. Now, I'm not going to be doing a deck tech on all of the decks we've got to cover, but I am going to cover the strategies and the archetype, if you will. Now, this is your basic Temur Energy build. This doesn't have any variation. There's quite a few other variants that we will cover, but this is your 4 Glorybringer, 4 Whirler Virtuoso build. Now, one of the things that has happened a lot in Temur here lately that I'm noticing is Magma Spray kind of leaving and more Abrades coming to the main deck. And that shift has always signaled the arise and fall of other 1.5 or tier 2 strategies. Now, this week we have noticed that in the different PPTQs and the release of the 5-0 decks, the ones that Wizards did release, the release of the 5-0 decks have given us more Temur Energy decks that have main board or more copies of main board Abrade. And I think that that would have a lot to do with why we're not seeing so many heavy artifact decks really push back up into the meta and become tier 1. So without going into it too deeply, Temur Energy still has my #1 spot as your tier 1 deck. Now, let's take a look at the second place in the meta. As much as I want to say it's blue-black control, I think it has to be Ramunap Red. Now, Ramunap Red has a just firm hold on the meta and has so ever since Paulo won with it in Hour of Devastation, and now here we are still facing Ramunap Red. Not a lot has changed in the deck. They lost a 2-mana burn that was sorcery, gained a 2-mana instant. Other than that, they shifted one of their 1-drops that they lost, and now they're running a few more Abrades main board. Again, you're going to see the main board artifact hate helping push back the rest of the meta. Now, Ramunap Red firmly holding the tier 2 or the tier 1 #2 slot, in my opinion. Now, #3, I'm going to have to go with blue-black control. Blue-black control is definitely top tier. Now, this is definitely dominating the meta. Those players that can play control know how powerful blue-black control has been over the years, and this is no different. With a good healthy source of counterspell and a good healthy draw engine, blue-black control has done some serious numbers on the meta. And this is probably going to be the first Scarab God deck we see here. Now, it doesn't have a lot of creatures of its own that it wants to use the Scarab God's ability for, but blue-black's controls answer to that is to counter your creatures and kill your creatures so that it can bring them back with the Scarab God, and it does that to great effect. So let's take a look at the last of our tier 1 strategies, and that's going to be the Winding Constrictor strategy that is found in Sultai Energy. Now, Sultai Energy is another Scarab God variant, and there are a couple different versions of this deck floating around, and I picked one that I thought was well suited. However, this is not as much of a Sultai Energy deck as it is a Scarab God Hostage Taker deck. It doesn't have all of the plus one counter variants that you would see, but there is another version of that floating around. I'm going to go ahead and cover that here because I actually think this is what the deck has morphed into and where the Sultai Energy is kind of settling in. And one of the things you're going to notice is Hostage Taker has been dropped. Now that doesn't mean that all the Sultai Energy decks have dropped Hostage Taker, but we are starting to see them adopt Bristling Hydra into the Sultai Energy strategy, and it does not affect the strategy enough to cause the variation to drop below a tier one strategy, and in some cases it actually solidifies and makes the deck a little bit more consistent. That being said, this is definitely a tier one strategy, and I really like our top four here with two copies of Energy, a control deck, and the Ramunap Red for aggro. Now, granted, we don't have any real combo in the meta, but it still kind of gives us this paper, rock, scissors meta that I've mentioned quite a few times. A friend of mine put it that way, and I like that version of a paper, rock, scissors meta, and that kind of develops our tier system. And with these being our top tier strategies, we have a lot of 1.5 strategies that are just variations of these very decks, and then some totally new strategies other than these tier 1 strategies that are viable in the meta because of that paper, rock, scissors meta. And the first one of those that we're going to look at today is going to be a variant of our top tier strategy, and that's Temur Energy, four color energy as most people call it, and that is Temur Energy that has splashed for the Scarab God. Now remember where it was Scarab God versus Glorybringer? Well, this deck actually runs both of those. Now most of these decks have a higher creature count than they do um, spell count, but the version I've picked for you today has runs mainboard Chandras, and I've seen some that actually run more copies of Glorybringer. There are a lot of different versions of Temur or four color energy, and there has even spawned from this four color energy variant yet another variant that a lot of people are also calling tier 1 or tier 1.5 viable, and I believe that those people are right. I honestly believe that this is a tier 1.5 strategy, and that is Temur Black, or Dark Temur as some call it. I prefer Temur Black, as we used to call things, like Jeskai Black, Temur Black, and such. So anyway, Temur Black is your four color Temur in the way that it runs Scarab God. However, here they have dropped nearly all of their red spells. You don't see any Chandras or anything like that, and they have taken up a couple black spells that help draw. Mainly the four glint sleeve siphoners and a couple other kill spells other than the harness lightnings that all the Temur decks run. Now in the sideboard they do run the Nissas, but there are no Chandras in this strategy. Now what did they replace that Chandra with? Well, Vraska. Vraska is being their top end. This has become the Temur Black top end, and strategy is to play Bristling Hydras, kind of like Sultai Energy splashed red maybe, and dropping the +1/1 counter package. It's almost a merge of Sultai and four color energy merged together. I kind of like it. It's very interesting. It lets you play a lot of both worlds, and because the cards are just powerful on their own, the energy package that builds up the backbones of these strategies is so powerful. You can play this strategy and play with these cards and still have a viable chance at winning your tournament. So those are the variants to Temur Energy. Let's go ahead and look at some of the variations to our blue black control deck. And the major variant that's come off of that deck is blue black mid-range. Now, in the blue black mid-range deck, they've dropped a lot of the counters and they've added a couple hardy creatures or versatile creatures. Um, Kitesail Freebooter allowing them to pull a card out of the hand and even get in for a little bit of early chip damage, giving them some tricks that they can play with, later with the Scarab God and things of that nature. And then Gifted Aetherborn coming in as some early creatures. This is a deck that wants to play an early creature or two and then kind of sit back and protect that creature with its few counter spells and things of that nature. It's also heavier on kill than it is on counter, but nonetheless, it is a Scarab God deck and is a tier 1.5 strategy in my opinion. So let's take a look at a variant on the mono red strategy, and that variant would be almost the same as the mono red that we're used to seeing. However, it runs some main board harsh mentors and a main board combat celebrant. Now, this is not a real big stretch on changing up the mono red strategy. However, this is just a variant of the mono red strategy that has kind of pre-boarded against decks like Temur Energy. Another variant on that mono red strategy that has popped up a little bit has been the red black strategy. Red black aggro, and there's also a red black vehicles, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the red black aggro is a lot of your mono red creatures. It's a lot of the creatures you see in that mono red or the mono red treasure uh, version of Ramunap Red. Now, all of these decks still run Ramunap Ruins, so that's why I'm kind of lumping them in together. It's still a Hazard deck, but it has the turn 2 combo of kill your 1-drop and then play its turn 2 Bone Picker, which is extremely, extremely powerful. I really like that line of play, and it's the main reason that this deck is actually even splashed black, at least main board. The sideboard is, however, full of black cards to help them deal with the other variants of other decks in the meta. So that is your variants of your top tier decks. Let's talk about my picks for the top tier 1.5 decks that are kind of standalone. And the number one pick for the very top of the tier 1.5, and I actually had a really hard time not just naming this as a tier 1 strategy, but as the deck has been kind of pushed out of the meta here lately with everyone, prepared for this deck, as of right now, I'm going to say that it is the top of the tier 1.5 strategies that aren't just variants of the tier 1 strategies. And this is blue white approach. This deck is a deck that wins not on your turn 4 or 5 mid game. This deck actually, the plan is to win on turn 9. However, it can win on turn 8 or so. Like if you have 2 of your approaches in hand, you can turn 7 approach and then turn 8 approach. But most of the time they want to spend turn 7 approaching and then turn 8 digging and then recast that approach again on turn 9 with some counter spell backup of some sort. And this deck is built to dig and protect itself to get to those levels, and it does that very well. And this is definitely, if you like to play control but yet you want that quick finish, hey, I've controlled the game for this long, now the game is over, this is the deck for you, and it is a viable strategy. However, do understand that most decks know of this deck and they are prepared for this deck. However, it has not been top 8ing here recently, so it may be a good time for a good blue-white approach deck to just pop back up in the meta. So that being the first of our standout strategies, the second going to be an old flashback in Mardu Vehicles. Really? Oh wow, I'm sorry. This list pulled wrong. Mardu Vehicles is going to be the list, and it doesn't really matter that it pulled wrong because except for this most recent weekend, Mardu Vehicles has not really shown up on the list as much. We've actually seen more variants like Mono Black Vehicles. We have that deck list right here, and Mono Black Vehicles is just a much more stable version of the vehicles list and has some really good synergies like Ruin Raider used to crew your Heart of Kirin. This deck is extremely good, and if the meta does turn into more of a mid-range to control type meta, the more you will see these decks arrive. However, because they are vehicles decks, they do get pushed back down a lot by the arrival of more main board abrades and cards of that nature in the top tier strategies. So the more prepared the top tier strategies are, the more likely you are to see these decks get pushed down. And in the most recent week, we have seen a lot more abrades and teamers. So that's vehicles. It is a very good list. I've personally ran it recently. You can find that link in the description below. Very good list. I enjoyed the list. But let's move on to our next strategy in the tier 1.5 list here, and that is tokens. Now we have a couple variants of tokens, but the top version of that list is your Abzan Tokens list. Now this list has popped up on quite a few SCG tournaments, large SCG tournaments, and the list is pretty straightforward. It's hidden stockpile, anointed procession combo with just ways to remain alive and to continuously trigger revolt. It has good answers to most of the meta and has a really good finisher in Veraska the Relic Seeker. The deck has an extremely versatile sideboard that allows it to combat most of the meta. So I really like the Abzan Tokens list, and I find it to be definitely a top-notch list if you don't want to run one of the main net deck list, as most people call them. Second is going to be the Esper version of tokens. The Esper version here is basically dropping the Veraska, which is the only green card in the Abzan list, for some Champion of Wits and the Scarab God. Now, one of the things I want to say about most of these white decks that this deck actually runs is 3 copies of Sunscourge Champion. This card has been arriving a lot more to help push back those aggro decks. So the more of this Sunscourge Champion we see, the more the aggro decks will get pushed back. The more abrades we see, the more of the artifact build around decks will get pushed back, and we'll talk a little bit more about those other than just vehicles. Speaking of those artifact build around decks, one of the major strategies that works around a really key artifact is Godpharaoh's Gift. Esper Godpharaoh's Gift has been showing up quite a lot in our meta here lately, and even won a few of the 5-0 lists that were posted lately, and I think it did really well in the most recent PPTQ. However, again, this week we've noticed a rise in the number of abrades, which should push back down some of these Godpharaoh's Gift decks. Now, this deck is just straightforward. It uses Gate to the Afterlife to help search up its Godpharaoh's Gift and cheat that 7 costed artifact into play, but it needs to put 6 creatures in the graveyard before it can do that, which the Gate does help with that, allowing you to loot, but mainly the deck has cards like Minister of Inquiries and such to pitch those away. Now, that is one of the top tier artifact build arounds, and the next one would be Oketra's Monument. Now, this is my personal favorite version of Oketra's Monument, as it is our only real vampire tribal deck that has done anything major in the meta. That being said, we haven't had a lot out of dinosaurs, we haven't had anything out of merfolk, and only the pirates that can be found in the blue-black mid-range deck can be considered as a pirates deck, or maybe the splash for a few pirates in some of the Sultai versions. But Believe it or not, vampires were the first ones to really put up some good numbers as a tribe, and it was Oketra's Monument allowed that. Now, this deck does have some rather basic vampires, but this being a 1 mana card that also gives you a token ends up becoming really good, and it works really well with um, their other vampires like Maverin Fane here. I'm sure I butchered that name. You can get me in the comments later for that. Also, we have another version of Monument in our meta, and that's the blue-white version. The Azorius version is basically still just splashing blue for a little bit of sideboard help and to run some Cloud Blazers in the main. That Other than that, the deck is also mono white. Now, other than vampires in this strategy, the deck runs more value creatures like Fairgrounds Wardens and Kanjali Sunwing, along with Glorybound Initiates and things of that nature. Both decks do run the Avery mechanic to help return those creatures to your hand so that you can recast those. And it's a really, really good combo. If you can get two of these down, you can start, playing them and bouncing the other one and such, and just play, 1 mana each, and just really flood your board. So it works really well with Oketra's Monument. But the fact that we do have multiple versions of Oketra's Monument in our meta means that the strategy is still there. And again, it really just depends on, artifact hate pushing this strategy out of the meta or not. Well, guys, that about does it. That is our standard meta coverage for this week. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe. I hope everyone enjoyed the show. I know I had a lot of fun. I hope you had fun. We'll see you next time here on the sideboard.